Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please support my channel by contributing to my Patreon account so that I can continue making the audiobook series. The part 2 of the book continues with the detailed narration of the Muslim conquest of North Africa, which is also known as the Muslim conquest of the Maghrib. The conquest was led initially by amrbinalaas and then continued on with uqbabinnafe. The conquest of North Africa lasted from 647 AD to 709 AD. Start of Part 2. The Conquest of North Africa. Start of Chapter 14. Objective Africa. Abdullah bin Saad settled down to ruling Egypt as its governor on behalf of the Caliph. Egypt was all his, a province of the Muslim state. He administered it well, showing intelligence and competence, with a special flair for getting money out of the province for Medina. And his master was well pleased with his governor and foster brother. There was no one to dispute his methods of extracting money from the copts, for amrbinalaas was now living in retirement on his estate in Palestine, and no comparable personality remained in Egypt. As soon as he had settled down as governor, Abdullah bin Saad began to send raiding parties to the west, to the townships and tribes which were not part of the population of Egypt. These raids were launched in the border region of the west, where Egypt blended with Libya, and where the local population was Berber rather than Coptic. The raiding parties had a wonderful time. They captured slaves and cattle and goods, and returned to Fustat laden with wealth, of which 1/5 was sent to Medina as the share of the state, and the remainder distributed among the raiders. Abdullah bin Saad was an avaricious man, and thought that all this plunder was the surest sign of success. This was a quick way of getting rich, and the soldiers too went into their new role with gusto. The easy wealth brought in by these raids had the effect of whetting Abdullah's appetite. There was obviously lots more where this came from, Roman territory west of Egypt, and the prospects of even greater plunder induced Abdullah to write to the Caliph about the matter. He described the situation on the borders of Egypt and asked for permission to launch a major campaign to the west. In Medina, Usman called a council of war. This was in late 26 Hijri. All the senior companions were gathered at the council. The latest news about Egypt and the situation on the border were discussed, and everyone present agreed that the time had come to launch another major offensive as part of the Holy War. As a result of the discussion at this council, Usman took the decision that the Muslims would go into Africa. Orders were given for a large force from Arabia to march to Egypt, and augmented by the Muslim army already there invade Roman territory in the west. Over the weeks, contingents of various sizes from various tribes concentrated for the Holy War, and soon an army of 10,000 warriors was gathered at Medina, the largest part being from the Quraysh and the immigrants and Ansars. The doors of weapon stores were thrown open, and arms issued to those who did not have any, and 1,000 camels were provided by the state for carrying those who did not possess mounts of their own. The soldiers were in high spirits. There was much excitement about the new campaign. The Muslims were full of eager anticipation of the two rewards promised by God to those of the faithful who engage in holy war: victory and the good of this world for those who conquered, paradise for those who lost their lives. There were some fine and noble officers going with the expedition, and also one or two not so noble, but most of the leaders were respected and venerated Muslims. There was Ma'bad bin Abbas, a cousin of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There was Abdul Rahman, son of the first Caliph of Islam, Abu Bakr radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. There were two sons of Caliph Umar radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, Abdullah and Ubaidullah, the first of whom was a virtuous and gallant Muslim. There was Abdullah, son of Zubair, and there was Abdullah bin amrbinalaas, who, in sight of the shabby treatment received by his father, joined the Holy War. All these were sons of the first generation of companions who had formed the army of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and had fought under him in the earliest battles of Islam. And these younger companions had covered themselves with glory in many campaigns fought in the time of the first two caliphs. Among those not so noble were two brothers, Marwan and Haris, sons of al-Hakam, of whom more will be said later. Before the departure of the expedition from Medina, Caliph Usman addressed the troops. He spoke of their duties as Muslims, of the religious obligation of the holy war in the way of Allah, and he wished them well. He ended his speech, "I have instructed Abdullah bin Sa'ad to be good to you. I appoint over you Haris bin al-Hakam until you get to Abdullah bin Sa'ad, whereupon the command will be his." In Muharram 27 Hijri, that is October 647 AD, the army filed out of Medina on its way to Egypt. Upon arrival at Fustat, it was received with great joy, and here another 10,000 soldiers from the army of Egypt joined the force from Medina, bringing the total strength of the army to a full 20,000 men. With this army, sometime in December 647, Abdullah bin Sa'd Abi Sarh marched for the west. His objective was Africa. The Arabs called it Africa and believed in the legend that it was so named because it had been discovered and settled by Farik, brother of Misr bin Baisar, whose story the reader has already listened to in chapter 2. When Misr was given Egypt as his reward, and he founded the city of Memphis, Farik went and colonized Africa. There were one or two other legends also, but this was the most commonly accepted one. But when the Arabs spoke of Africa or Africa, they did not mean the Africa that we know today. They meant the northern belt of Africa bordering the Mediterranean, between Egypt and the Maghrib, the latter meaning west. Africa started at Barqa and stretched westwards up to Bajaya on the Algerian coast, near the present Algiers. Some geographers placed its western boundary at Tangier, and its eastern between Barqa and Alexandria, at a place called Uqba, thus making Africa even longer. But according to the general consensus, it comprised the northern zone of what is now Libya, Tunisia, and eastern Algeria. The Romans too regarded Africa as just this, though pushing it somewhat westerly, that is from Tripoli to Tangier, which last named was once called Mauritania. Beyond Africa lay the Maghrib, or West. Nowadays when we speak of the Maghrib, we speak of the region of Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, but at the time of which this history is about, the Maghrib was regarded as more westerly, that is western Algeria and Morocco. In the chapters that follow, all three terms are freely used. Africa, meaning the region between Barqa and Bajaya, the Maghrib, meaning the region between Bajaya and the Atlantic, and North Africa, used in the modern sense to include both regions. The northern part of Africa was not barren, as it is now. Today, this part of Africa consists mainly of the enormous expanse of the Sahara, more than 3 million square miles of it, with its northern borders formed up by the Mediterranean lands and the Atlas Mountains, marking its northwestern edge in all three Maghrib countries. Africa, even the Sahara Desert, was once greener and more populous. It was grassland and forest land. It had once been cool and wet and until as late as 10,000 years ago, which was soon after the last glacial phase of the Pleistocene epoch, the Ice Ages, the land was covered with trees. For several millennia after, large parts of it had evergreen forests and Mediterranean-type scrub, while herds of elephants, zebra and ostrich walked across the green face of the land, and its flowing rivers teemed with fish. In the 6th millennium BC, early in the Neolithic period, there was abundant rainfall and good communications existed across the continent. But about 5,000 years ago, the good time ended and the land began to dry. What followed was a transition to aridity, the present aridity, and this transition was completed by 1000 BC. Since then, Africa has been as we see it now, with the Sahara as the greatest and most barren desert in the world. In terms of human life also, the Sahara used to be more active, and long before recorded history was widely occupied. Prehistoric rock paintings scattered throughout the region, particularly in the southern foothills of the Atlas Mountains, and the Hogger and Tibesti ranges reveal the presence of man living an organized life with buffalo, giraffe, and elephant abounding. 10,000 years ago, agriculture was firmly established and animals domesticated. In fact, because of the greenness of the region, the horse was in common use in Africa, especially before the present aridity set in, as is evident from the rock paintings. It was only during the last few centuries before the Christian era, after the aridity had fully set in, that the camel made its appearance in Africa. A brief summary of the historical development of North Africa, and it is simple enough, will enable the listener to better understand the cultural and political environment in which the Muslim invasion under Abdullah bin Saad took place. The first inhabitants, those who made the rock paintings and stone artifacts, were Negroes or partly Negroid, obviously from the south or Sudan. The Muslims used the word Sudan, land of blacks, for the whole desert and scrub belt which stretched along the south of North Africa, from the present Sudan, across Chad, Niger, and Mali, to Mauritania. That is the belt south of the present Arabic-speaking countries of Africa. But the Negroid people of the rock paintings were eventually overpowered and replaced by Eurasian migrants who were fully established in Africa by 1000 BC. These people became known earlier as the nation of Libyans, the first historical nation of North Africa. These Libyans were there when the Phoenicians landed in North Africa in the 8th century BC and built the city of Carthage, which they called Kart Hadasht, meaning new city, and a great trading and maritime empire was established by them. But after several centuries they came into conflict with Rome, and 3 long drawn-out wars, known as the Punic Wars, were fought between the Carthaginians and the Roman Empire. It was in the second of these years that the Romans landed in North Africa near Carthage in 204 BC in order to bring Hannibal to battle, and 2 years later they fought and defeated Hannibal at Zama. The Romans let go of North Africa again, and again Carthage rose against Rome in the Third Punic War. Again Carthage lost, this time to make sure that the Carthaginians never raised their heads again. The Romans razed Carthage to the ground in 146 BC and made Africa a Roman province stretching from Tripoli to Tangier. The Romans were now here to stay, and in the 4th and 5th centuries AD, the settled areas of Africa were partially Christianized. Meanwhile, another migration of barbarians had begun from the east of the Eurasian continent. These were the German tribes, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, etc., large enough to be called nations. These nations first appeared in Western Africa in the 4th century AD. In the beginning of the 5th century, they crossed the Rhine and a few years later overran most of Gaul and Spain. The Visigoths invaded Italy and in 410 sacked Rome. In Spain, the major barbarian nation was the Vandals. In Africa, the Roman governor, Count Boniface, who had his capital at Carthage, invited the Vandals to come to Africa. Soon after realizing the enormity of what he had done, he withdrew the invitation, but the Vandals came anyway, attracted by the wealth of Africa. In 429, King Genseric, or Genseric, led his nation of 80,000 Vandals into Africa and defeated the imperial forces stationed in the province. By 442, the Vandals had established themselves as rulers of North Africa and were recognized by Rome as a sovereign state. The Eastern Roman Empire, based on Constantinople, made an attempt to regain Africa in 468, but the attempt failed and the Roman troops were badly mauled by the Vandals. Then Justinian came to the throne at Constantinople and sent Belisarius with 18,000 men to bring Africa back into the imperial fold. In 533, Belisarius defeated and destroyed the Vandal kingdom. The Vandals renamed, of course, but as subjects of Rome. Late in the 6th century, with some reorganization of the imperial administration, a new appointment of Exarch was created at Carthage, the Exarch being a kind of viceroy ruling Africa on behalf of the emperor at Constantinople. This brings us to the time of our history. The father of Emperor Heraclius, who took over the empire in 610, was the Exarch at Carthage, in other words, the governor of Africa. Heraclius died in 641, having appointed in the later part of his reign a patrician named Gregory as exarch or prefect of Carthage. After Heraclius, there was chaos at Constantinople. His two sons wore the imperial purple one after the other, and one after the other lost it. These were Constantine and Heracleonas, the latter being a son of Heraclius from his incestuous marriage with his niece Martina. In the same year, 641, Heraclius's grandson Constans II became emperor and some degree of stability returned to the Eastern Roman Empire. But eventually he had to flee Constantinople and went to Sicily. In 668, he was killed in his bath by an attendant. During the reign of Constans II in 647, in fact only a few months before Caliph Usman sent his army from Medina to Fustat, Gregory broke all links with the empire. He declared himself king and struck coins in his own name, and in this he had the support of the local population of Carthage. So when the Muslims set off from Fustat for Africa in the end of 647, they invaded the realm of King Gregory, stretching from Tripoli to Tangier. It was a powerful kingdom sprawling for 2,000 miles along the Mediterranean coast, a land full of wealth and full of soldiers. The sands of the desert held no terrors for the Muslims. They were warriors of the desert, born and bred in the desert and looked upon the desert as home. They could live, move, and fight in the desert better than anyone else, and this was a great advantage to them when fighting more sophisticated enemies than themselves. The faithful were again on the warpath, 20,000 warriors, and very large part of this army consisted of cavalry. Everyone was mounted on horse or camelback, and a large number of soldiers had horses. The soldiers were trained to fight on foot and on horseback. Whoever had a horse was a cavalryman as long as the horse was there, and he who had no horse was a foot soldier. The main body of the army was preceded by groups of light, fast-moving skirmishers, who rode well ahead of the army to make sure that the line of advance was clear. If any enemy were discovered in the territory, he would be disposed of by these skirmishers, who also gathered food and forage as they moved on. The advance of this army was like the move of an enormous caravan, with the loaded camels swaying and swinging gracefully in spite of their ugly shape and clumsy gait. It was a splendid sight. It was also a most unusual move because this powerful army had no line of communication over which supplies had to be moved to in war. It had no depots, no dumps, no arsenal. It did have a strategical base inasmuch as Egypt was the base from which the conquest of Africa was launched. But the army itself had no logistical base for operations. It did not need one. The administrative system of the Muslim army had advanced a bit since the simple beginnings of Muslim warfare at Medina, soon after the migration of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But it had remained an unsophisticated and unspoiled military force. The men had no uniform, wore whatever they liked and possessed, and could carry any kind of weapon and armor. There was no standard army issue, and most of the weapons and armor owned by the soldiers were either purchased or taken in battle. The food of this army marched along with it, herds of cattle and flocks of sheep. It was what nowadays the quartermasters would call meat on hoof. If the worst came to the worst, the men could live for weeks on a simple diet of dates and water, and they carried the dates as emergency rations. They did not care if their communications were severed, because there was no supply convoy to move up behind them, and if the column were threatened on the move, it could leave the route of advance and vanish in the desert in an hour or so, leaving no trace behind. The women and children of the army shared the hardships of the journey with their menfolk. The families almost always moved with the men. In the first place, campaigns were so long and so much time elapsed before men could return home that the soldiers preferred to have their women and children with them. In the second place, since Muslim armies were conquering armies and took over more countries as they marched on, the soldiers with their families often settled down in the conquered lands. Finally, the women and children carried out important administrative services. They helped in pitching and striking tents, in packing and loading the stores from the move, and in battle women performed the role of nurses, dressing wounds and caring for the wounded. When their men died, they buried them, and always they were ready to fight. The army crossed the Nile from Fustat to Giza across the Isle of Rhoda, and then took the road along the left bank of the Nile. Before reaching Alexandria, it left the main road and plunged into the desert. But after some days of marching, it hit the Mediterranean coast and then marched along the coastal road. The Muslims went past many places which then had no importance, but which would become famous 13 centuries later as a result of the desert campaigns of the Second World War. Al-Alamein, Mirza Matruh, Sidi Barrani, Bardia, and Tobruk. After nearly 6 weeks on the move, the columns arrived at Barqa, the peaceful occupation of which by amrbinalaas has already been described in chapter 11. The city was known in Roman times as Pentapolis and was the capital of the province of Cyrenaica, but the Arabs named it Barqa. Apparently, they called any place Barqa if it was a region of bright stones of many colors, as this was. Before the Muslim invasion of Egypt, the Romans had as their empires the whole Mediterranean coast from the Red Sea to a little short of the Atlantic. There was Egypt in the east and Africa in the west, which for the Romans began at Tripoli, and in between was Cyrenaica, with its capital at Pentapolis. This was neither Egypt nor Africa, but a kind of no man's land province between the two. After the subjugation of this province by amrbinalaas, it was part of no empire or kingdom, but vaguely submitted to the Muslim power at Fustat. All was peaceful at Barqa. After a few days' rest and replenishment of supplies, the Muslims marched on. It was now February 648, Jamadiul Awwal 27 Hijri. They were headed for the real Africa. the Africa of the Romans ruled by King Gregory, which started at Tripoli 1,000 miles away. End of chapter 14.